The last of the 10 Makot, known as Makat Bechorot, the attack on the firstborn, has always stood out in my mind as being extremely deadly and a little bit excessive. On that night at midnight on the 15th of Nisan, right before the Jewish people left Egypt, every single Egyptian firstborn, be it all the firstborn humans or the firstborn animals, they were all died in a moment, just like that. The firstborn of every single household was suddenly gone. And Chazal connect this and contrast it to the end of this week's Parsha, the end of Parsha Bo, where God gives a command to the people. He says, Kadesh li kol b'chor peter kol racham b'vnei Yisrael b'adam u'v'abema, that you should sanctify every single firstborn Jew, whether it be Jewish person or Jewish animal. The firstborn is supposed to be sanctified and dedicated towards God. And Chazal connect the two by saying, since Hashem spared the firstborn Jews and did not kill them by Makat Bechorot, therefore they now owe their lives to God and have dedicated their lives to God. And they have to dedicate their lives to a service of God. And ends up being that the firstborns aren't the ones who serve God. It ends up being the Kohanim take their place, which is why we have, when a firstborn son is born, we have the concept of Pidyon Haben, where the firstborn son redeems himself and the father of the firstborn son gives money to a Kohen, and the Kohen swaps out the firstborn, takes the place of the firstborn. But really, fundamentally, the firstborn son of every family owes his life to God in place of the fact that he wasn't killed and the firstborn sons of all the Egyptian families were all killed. But the connection isn't just superficial, that the firstborn Egyptians were killed and the firstborn Jews were not, and now the firstborns owe their lives to God. But there's actually a deeper connection going on over here. And it has to do with what the firstborn, or the first of anything, represents. And if you think about it, the first time you meet someone, when you have a first impression, that gives you a sense of who that person is. And the first is representative of the entire whole, or your first day of something new. It kind of gives you a sense of how the entire thing is going to go. If your first day of something is good, then you have a feeling that the next couple of weeks are going to be good. But if your first day of something is bad, then you have a feeling the next couple of weeks are going to be bad. The first is always representative of the whole. And it's the same thing over here. When it comes to Makat Bechorot, Rav Hirsch points out that Hashem wasn't killing all the firstborns to punish the Egyptians per se, but he was doing it to teach them a lesson. He said, Egyptians, you are living a life of death and destruction and cruelty, and that's not the way you're supposed to live. And I want to show this to you in a tangible way. I want to show you that you're living a life of death and destruction by causing you to experience the death and destruction that you're inflicting and imposing on others. And that's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu kills every firstborn Egyptian, because the first always represents the whole. And by killing all the firstborns and showing that the first of every single family is dying and being destroyed, he's showing that every single family, every single Egyptian is representative of this death and destruction, this cruelty, which is not what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants. And then we can contrast that to what we have at the end of the Parsha, the Kadesh li kol b'chor, that all the firstborn of the Jewish people, they aren't filled with death and destruction, but they're instead filled with Kedusha, with holiness, of sanctification, of closeness to God. And just like the firstborns of the Egyptians represented the entirety of Egypt, so too the firstborns of the Jews represent the entirety of Am Yisrael. And Hashem is telling Am Yisrael that as opposed to the Egyptians, who all represented death and destruction as was symbolized by the firstborns, when it comes to the Jews, you guys don't represent death and destruction, you represent life and holiness and closeness and connection to God. And that's represented by your firstborns, who are dedicated and sanctified and going to be immersed in Avodat Hashem, in service of God. And it's this beautiful contrast between the Egyptians and the Jews, showing what our lives are all about. Our lives are not about cruelty and death and destruction. Our lives are about closeness and holiness to God. It's represented by our firstborns, but it's not limited to the firstborns. It's an ideal and a value that could be lived by every single one of us, and hopefully will be lived by every single one of us. This is the strength of Am Yisrael. Everyone have a great Shabbos. Bye-bye.